And we are live as Brian maneuvers his headset.
Hmm.
It says, Brian, it says you have a guest destination malfunction, but they let you know. Whatever. Do you see that? Some error in the top right corner. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Live Productions. Very cool. Anyhow, we are here for the Enterprise Month in Review, and I am joined by Brian Summer. Now, we had a couple months off from the Enterprise Month in Review, Brian, so we kind of violated our show premise there. But anyhow, the gist of it is we are here now, and we welcome you to join us in the review. And Brian, we don't have a guest today, so you and I got to do the heavy lifting, but man, we got some controversial stories. I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah, I think we'll motor through this. We will not have a problem with the time. And if I know anything, like Dennis Howlett, neither you nor I are needlessly under-opinionated. So we'll leave it at that.
No, I'm actually worked up a head of steam about it. One story in particular, right before breaking news, thanks to Thomas Weber Knight. So, okay, Brian, your slides are ready to go. So let's see what we got here. By the way, folks on LinkedIn, if you can just comment to let me know that you're seeing the stream, that'd be awesome. And here are the slides. And Brian, here's our agenda.
Yeah, there's a couple of different things we snuck in this time. We're going to have a quote of the day, and we'll tell you a little bit about event travel. Not that that's really terribly interesting for most folks. The special guest is not happening this week. It's going to be actually our halftime show. And we're going to let John vent on a couple of his favorite topics. And then, some of the usual stuff. Let's get right to it. John, let's go to the cringy buzzword of the month.
Indeed.
There it is, productivity. It's not a new word, but I love it now in the context of all the conversation on remote work and work, and return to office. People have been wondering about how they calculate productivity. And there's apparently a whole bunch of folks who are putting on the appearance of working and being productive, but they really aren't. Anyway, I got to say, I kind of like the word myself, but anyhow.
Yeah, man. The journey from productivity to productivity has a lot of pitfalls. I think I've fallen in a few of them this week.
John's been a bad boy. Yeah. Maybe we'll have to hear what those pitfalls are as the show progresses.
I need to work on some B-roll for my meetings so I can step away from the camera a little bit. All right, here we go. Quote of the month.
Yeah, so this week I was at I Am Phenom, a great talent acquisition vendor at their conference. And one of the speakers put a slide up that started off with good science fiction writers would predict drones. But a great science fiction writer would predict the after effects of drones. And I added that part here about we need industry analysts to predict the after effects of AI. And that's something you don't hear a whole lot of conversation about. I know John's probably going to talk quite a bit about after effects here during the halftime show. But I thought it was an interesting parallel because when I first saw the beginning slide come up about a good science fiction writer would predict drones, I'm thinking, man, they should have predicted that 60 years ago or more. But anyway, the point's a good point, and I think dealing with the after effects is certainly something more people need to focus in on. All the knock-on and unintended consequences of new tech ought to be enough to make you really think about whether just because you can do something or use a technology, it may not always be the right idea to do it. Any thoughts, John?
No, we are on to the next.
So I think a lot of you saw on the news that Southwest Airlines is making some big changes, one of which is now charging people for bags. And that had me pretty bummed out, not because I ever check bags or check them on Southwest, but it was just the whole idea that they've pretty much become just like every other airline. And then it made me wonder if in a year's time, we'll be talking about them the way we used to talk about the new Coke, classic Coke dilemma that Coca-Cola fell into a decade or so ago. I think we may find Southwest regretting they make this move at some point, but that's neither here nor there right now.
So, just real quick on this story, because I'm a Southwest flyer, so I take all this very personally. I'm still waiting on Southwest's reply on how they're differentiated now that they are no longer doing the things that differentiated them, such as open seating and bags fly free and stuff like that. And second, Elliott management, screw you, man. You're totally wrong on this. You are bleeding this company for short-term revenues and taking away every aspect of their differentiation. It's gonna fail. In 5 years, you will not have done a thing for this company. You are just pulling earnings out with short-term ideas. And now, like we saw in one of these blog posts, Southwest will not only not be differentiated, they'll be worse than other airlines. So I'm really curious to see how this plays out, because I think these are big mistakes, but we'll find out.
So, John, if you have an opinion on this, let's go ahead and get it out, okay? I mean, I think you're holding something back here. Well, it's definitely not the airline that when I started flying them back so many years ago. The flight attendants wore hot pants. Everyone on the plane got a cocktail and a peanuts. And you don't see any of those on those flights anymore, any of that. So it's not what it used to be, is probably the understatement of the year. But that's the bad news. What's the good news, John? What's the good news on Southwest?
Oh, yeah. Well, Brian, it's not totally good news, and I'll tell you why. Because you and I weren't on the flight.
Well,
but yeah, Southwest made some headlines. I'm not sure how much more we need to say about it exactly, but.
Well, I just know that I've been on 6 flights where somebody got arrested. So, I attract a great crowd onto an airplane. But I've never had this scenario happen before. But, with all the conferences you and I have to attend to and all the different times we crawl on a 737, 700, or 800 to get to them, I don't think either one of us, I've never heard you talk about seeing something of this news importance and neither have I. But anyway, mine are usually the more pedestrian, drunks and people high on some kind of drug or something like that. That's what I get on planes.
The last excitement I got was watching someone get escorted away from TSA in handcuffs. That was pretty cool. But other than that, Brian, I've had pretty uneventful travels of late.
I was at Hartsfield not long ago, and a guy was trying to carry a pistol through the checkpoint, and he got rewarded with a not rapid reward, but a rapid arrest. And I asked somebody, one of the deputies that showed up, I go, this happened a lot. And he goes, would you believe this happens like a dozen times a week here at Hartsfield? And I'm like, wow. All right. Well, let's get on with the main point of this show. It's about tech. So, what do we have to say about tech this month, John?
Here we go. So, and by the way, I know a few of you are on the stream, and I think the commenting's working. So, if you can just chime in, let us know you're here. That would be great, and we'll try to work your feedback into the show as we go. So now we are into the top picks, and so this was interesting because this is like actually kind of complicated to understand, but there was I thought a pretty surprising and interesting victory from Thomson Reuters over a competitor that had essentially used Thomas Reuters material, in an AI training scenario, and the ruling win against Ross. And it's kind of a complicated thing that involves how fair use is going to get interpreted. But the thing that I'm a little bit worked up about at the moment is that big AI companies are attempting to redefine. They're basically trying to win out of court, and I want to see them, compete in court and take their lumps or win, and respect the legal system. In the UK, there's been this push. We reported it on Diginomica, which is quite interesting. One really interesting thing about the UK version is that at the moment, a major AI, Chris Middleton's been writing about this, but a major AI group came out in favor of protecting creatives and keeping current copyright law and protecting the creative industry. And one of the reasons I think that's important is that it's not just about what big AI needs today. It's about future training. And if you don't have a viable content industry, then you have nothing else for AI to train on except for regurgitated AI and synthetic data. And that doesn't really work. So it works only in a limited way. So it's really interesting here because the fair use criteria get a little tricky. And one of the key criteria is to what degree is it transformative or not. And so it'll be very interesting. So there seems to be a little bit of interesting precedent being set here that could be challenging for big AI, but the answer is not to go outside the legal system and try to subvert democracy, which is what OpenAI just did today, trying to appeal to Donald Trump's AI action plan to essentially declare AI training fair use. And so what I would say to Sam Altman is, how about respecting the judicial system a little bit and try to make your best case? And, I don't really feel like living in a country where when things don't go your way or you think you might not get a good deal, you just basically say, okay, well, let's just let the executive branch take care of this. And we don't really need checks and balances. So I'm very, very, very troubled by this notion of trying to maneuver outside the legal system. Now, having said that, I think over time, copyright law is going to need to evolve to incorporate some of what we're learning from these new use cases. So I'm not at all opposed to seeing some things evolve over time. But at the moment, like this whole notion of trying to, I can't win in court, so I'm going to curry favor with oligarchs. That doesn't work for me. I'm not happy. It's wrong. So anyway, more opinions from John Reed.
I actually agree with you, John, but I've been a lot more strident on this point with some very large firms that have tried to repurpose, reuse, and just flat out lift some of my intellectual property. And I go after them. I'm unsparing of that. Now I understand if somebody makes a mistake and, take something and post it up, but I know behind the scenes, John, you knew, I guess it was probably 2 years ago. It looked like some guy took an article I wrote about a conference I attended and changed a few verbs. That's really it, and republished large chunks of it. What he really did was plagiarize. And I thought he had used an AI tool to kind of rewrite it, but he had plagiarized the piece and provided no attribution for it. I called him and really slapped him down and his employer on it. I didn't go after and sue them and everything else because this guy just frankly did not know what the law was relative to fair use or anything. I'm not unreasonable, but big companies have the people, the legal staff and everything else. They know what they're doing and they shouldn't be doing this. So, I even added in the front of this, the last book I wrote, a whole section in there that, this is on that page in a book where you have your Library of Congress number and all that stuff. I put in there that no part of that book can be used for AI training. And by God, if you do, and I find out, I'm coming after you with both barrels, or words to that effect. Anyway, this is serious stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting in many different ways. Like we could spend a half an hour on this topic because where big AI has been getting into trouble is they've been making a fair use and transformative argument, which is a little bit different than what you're describing, where someone intentionally lifts copy and modifies it a little bit, which is a violation of copyright law. But what these big AI firms are trying to say is that this is a transformative use, but where they're getting into trouble again and again is verbatim copy and visual, like copyrighted copy has been pulled from these systems frequently to demonstrate that there are verbatim components inside of these systems. So it's a very tricky argument for them to make. But what I'm saying is they need to go make that argument and they need to take it to court and work through it. And then you figure out what's to be done about it. And in some cases, the solution will be to settle out of court with far superior licensing arrangements that people can enter into. But that's a whole different discussion. But the other really interesting aspect of this is one of the reasons that Sam Altman and OpenAI, went this far is they're obviously they're trying to protect a business which is at the moment unprofitable and needs all the help it can get, with Microsoft taking critical distance from them as well in certain ways. But pot shots aside, they're they're saying that we'll lose the AI arms race to China if you don't make these accommodations and make it possible for us to freely use anyone's copyrighted material. And the problem that I have with that is that it assumes that the AI arms race is all about just bigger and bigger and bigger data and consuming any data that we can find, no matter who owns it. And I don't actually think that's where the breakthroughs are going to come. And the interesting thing about that is that DeepSeek, for example, which has arguably done some of the more interesting AI innovations in the last year by redefining the cost structure around inference and around compute and around training, they did that precisely because they didn't have access to a lot of the state-of-the-art GPUs and the best stuff. They were actually constrained and they didn't have access to it. And so they reinvented some things. And actually, I think that's where the AI breakthroughs are going to come, Mr. Altman, is not through competing in an arms race, but actually it's going to be people who aren't under as much pressure to commercialize and are doing really cool, interesting things to combine LLMs with other forms of technology and more compound systems, as they call them. And so I actually think that this whole argument that we're going to lose to the Chinese if we don't have unfettered access to everyone's hard-won intellectual property is complete bullshit. And, but it concerns me a lot because this case is being made to people who I know believe that they have the power to make these decisions without regard to what the court decides. And I would just like to encourage people to look at this from a legal perspective and let's work out our legal system to update it and modernize it to contend with these issues as much as possible. But let's not reject the legal system when we start feeling sorry for ourselves about what it decides. Take your lumps.
I don't know if others on the call could tell, but it sound like there are ambulances or fire trucks out there, which
yeah,
I didn't know if
I'm under
you queued up a
surveillance
sound effect, for your incendiary remarks there, John. But anyway, all right, let's go to the next story because
by the way, feel free to type in your comment. I haven't seen any yet, but I think you're out there. So keep going because I have a bunch of viewers on the stream. So, all right, Brian. Oh, this is me too. I can't pass the ball to you. This is me. Okay. Return to office. Okay. So just real quick on this because I think we have other stories to cover. And return to office, I think, we've covered this from a lot of angles in the past. But the one thing I wanted to point out is I got a little bit sparked by Madeline Bennett's article for Diginomica on the return to office trend isn't about productivity. It's about underhand cost savings and control. And one of the things I didn't mention in my monthly summary my weekly around this was that I think this is, and I'd love to get your opinion about this, Brian, but I know that a lot of folks have said, well, part of these return to office policies are about essentially kind of a passive form of headcount reduction. This seems like a really, really flawed way to reduce headcount to me. I don't know. It feels like you're going to lose a lot of your best people that way. Am I wrong in that?
Well, there have been some examples that, particularly where companies want to do a reduction workforce, but they're too cowardly to just flat out come out and announce it. So what they do is, by introducing this, they create the situation where people who are nowhere near where their offices were, many of which moved like during the pandemic, they're the ones that are going to have to make those tough choices to leave. It's funny you bring that up because there was an article I was reading today, and I want to say it was Taltivity or whatever sent it to me, and they talk about how companies that experience, like, if there's a 1% drop in workforce because of either something like this or RIF or what have you, well, you don't actually get, and you can claim you're getting rid of the underperformers, but as it turns out, it's the high performers who leave in a disproportionate number out of a company because to them, they smell problems and they want to move and they have the mobility and the market available to them to make career changes, and they will bolt. So their whole point of view was, if you're doing some of these boneheaded moves, you're not going to necessarily get rid of all the lower performing people. You may be actually looking at a real flight of your high performers.
Right. And my overall take on return to office is I actually welcome a range of policies because I'd like to see who wins the so-called war for talent based on these different policies that are enacted. But just real quick in the summary that I did of this topic, I struggle with this topic because I think there's fundamentally kind of a failure of imagination around how to best rethink this. Like we have an opportunity to really rethink like what is effective in an office context and what is not, right? So in other words, like enacting a return to office policy and then walking in and seeing everyone on different Zoom meetings in their cubicles or, work, desks doesn't really feel like a good use of an office, environment given the commuting stuff. So what I went through was like that few companies have really taken this opportunity to rethink, and it's hard to get to the bottom of these, what works well when we're hiding behind these mandates. And, my final points are that, culture, the idea that you have to like return to office to have like a viable workplace culture to me is absurd. But the one thing that I do acknowledge, and I would prefer to see things like experimenting with, especially when you think about young people who want to be social and are early in their careers, like experimenting with other productivity centers and places to meet for work or outside of work that are closer to the commuting pattern. So instead of having to go into the central every day, do it more regionally with like shared workspaces and stuff. I feel like there's a whole lot of stuff that hasn't been looked at that could be really creative and viable. The one thing I struggle with, Brian, and I would love to get your take on this before we move to the next, is if you're a worker with eyes on advancement within your company, I argue that you should be spending some time in the office just because I just feel like it's really hard to work the political angles of advancing inside of an organization when you're remote all the time. Is that wrong? I mean, I'd like to believe that it didn't matter, but I feel like there's something about the politics of most workplaces that if you're remote, you end up struggling in that so-called advancement game. Is that a problem, or are we more mature than that? Have we moved beyond that now?
I think I think that those that do show up, right, wrong, actually they have a better opportunity to be seen and to be heard in the company. And that knowledge, if you're an exec or manager, you like to promote people that you at least have familiarity with, and maybe they're not getting that kind of experience with their staff if it's only done by Zoom calls. So some office contact is, I think it's beneficial for both the company, the leadership, and the employee itself. I don't think it has to be 5 days a week or 24/7 or whatever. Nothing quite like that. I've done it. I implemented it at Accenture for my part of Accenture at headquarters in the early mid '90s, but for us, I just limited it to come in on. You could choose not to come in on Fridays if you didn't want to or whatever. And we had some other kind of things we put in place, and it worked just fine. I mean, I know in some roles you got to do it, obviously, but um, I'll tell you what, the readers ought to look up this video of Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. He went on a tear.
Oh my gosh.
And if you watch that, you're going to see two things. One is a case study in how not to motivate employees, because he's just ranting, is what it is. And two, it'll give you an understanding of how some executives think. You may not agree with it, but it's important to understand kind of where some of these people are coming from. And you'll get that from watching Jamie Dimon's video.
Yeah. So it was just kind of my pushback against some remote work enthusiasts who are like, the politics shouldn't matter. And I'm just saying to you folks out there who believe that the politics of face-to-face relationships do matter. Take that into account in your career progression. But like Brian says, that doesn't mean be in the office all the time by any means. I'm just saying that the idea that we can somehow move past politics in promotions and stuff is, sorry, it's just not, I was going to use the word insane. That's not quite fair, but it's just not realistic. Thomas, welcome. You've already experienced that in the 90s. reduction in force, literally a reduction in force, the armed forces, and they lost a lot of the best people. Yeah, so it's such a questionable way of approaching the issue of headcount management. So Brian, let's move on. These are your top stories, and you got 4. So this is the first of them. What you got?
So I'll be quick. There was a story in Inc. about people complaining that they're going through the recruiting process and then they hear nothing, or they go through quite a bit of the process, even doing interviews, and they still don't hear anything about like, did I get selected or not? And these processes just seem to go on or whatever. But there are 2 problems. One is the lack of communication, and 2 is the timeliness or lack thereof of it. When so this writer plugged in with some recruiters and some big time consultants in the recruiting industry to find out what is the issue here. Why is it that people aren't hearing it? And it turns out that seems like some of these recruiters are dealing with tremendous volumes of candidates, but they're sitting on the process. They want to let the resumes, I guess, age like a fine wine or cheese before they're going to, finish winnowing things down and making a decision. Or they're whatever it is, there is a decision maker somewhere that has decided to kind of stop the process, and that apparently is incredibly common. So there is a gap between what someone told recruiting a long time ago, like, go find us like 10 operators for fork trucks or something. And then all the other decision makers in between that screening moment and when they're actually going to say onboard the person now, there are too many people that are blocking it. So these people about blockers are just all over the place. And the process, talk about a process that needs serious reimagining and reinvention. This is it. Anyway, it's just a nice background is what it is.
Snarky comment time. I thought AI agents are going to fix this, Brian. Sorry.
No, man, don't do that when I'm trying to drag. I mean, you're going to make me. All right.
Yeah, we'll get back to agents in just a little bit. Preview coming attractions. All right, Brian, what's next?
I thought there was some sobering text in this story. I think it was, Bloomberg Business Week. It was on why GM gave up on self-driving cars. And you just read this first excerpted paragraph about companies have been putting all these automated self-driving cars on the road for 15 years. And they still, I thought this was the most painful quote, they still can't match the capabilities of an Uber driver. And, that should give people a lot of pause for cause about turning this kind of stuff over to an automated tool. It also points out another problem. The article doesn't get into this, but it's this AI compounding problem where the software is making decision after decision after decision, long strings of decisions to figure out how to navigate your car from point A to point B. And any one failure along the way or a hallucination, whatever, and everything, blows up. If you read the second excerpt, it talks about how the last sentence about the tendency of these AI tools to hallucinate facts, which roughly parallels a persistent problem in driverless cars known as phantom braking that hasn't been fixed yet. Now, I actually was in one of these cars in Las Vegas, and it was doing exactly that. We couldn't hardly get out of the hotel circular drive at the front of the hotel property because the car would go about 4 feet and stop and go another 2 or 3 feet and stop. It just kept doing that. And what are you going to do as a passenger? You just kind of have to sit there and go like, I guess this car is going to have to its AI is going to have to work this stuff out. But anyway, when you read this story, it won't give you a whole lot of confidence about the agentic AI models. And I'm sure John's going to blow our mind in a minute here on what he knows on this issue.
Yeah, well, I'll just say for now that I think what's really interesting about AI, and it's been a problem for a long time, despite what the AI evangelists, which includes some people that I used to really respect their judgment, unfortunately, will tell you, is the AI has kind of a 20% problem, which is that the first 80% is always really impressive. And then the 20% where you get it into the real world context gets a lot harder. And what we're finding in enterprise situations, which is similar to self-driving cars, is that sometimes you can get up to 95%. And for self-driving cars, that means in controlled environments in certain urban areas that have nice weather and are, pretty carefully, calm. They're not chaotic. You can get to that 95% or whatever. And, the encouraging thing for some vendors is that 95% can be good enough for certain things if you're careful about how you design it. But the other problem is the outlier problem, which is you also have to look at what that other 5% looks like. And that's one of the other big problems with self-driving cars, for example, which is sometimes the outliers are really bad. And so people will say, well, humans can make mistakes too. That's true. But would a human drive a woman behind their car for 20 feet, dragging them? No, right? So you need that outlier sensibility when you're thinking about AI use cases as well, right? So which is like, okay, what is the cost of the mistake? And if the mistake tolerance is fine, then you can live with that 95% and deal with your 5% mistakes. But if the 5% mistakes are, well, it calculated our tax liability wrong, and we got a couple of phone calls from our auditor, then that's not acceptable. Anyway, so on we go to Brian's next story.
This one, this I thought was something a little more out of the normal enterprise talk, but it's talked about how many giant battery kind of locations are being set up all around the world. And what they do is they can use excess power being generated by solar or other systems, store it, and then it can be pushed back into the grid at a later point. But these places where these batteries are just like nondescript, small, like tilt wall industrial park kind of buildings. The batteries are relatively safe. They're also made differently they're not necessarily like lithium ion or NiCad. And some are made with iron, some are copper, some are nickel. And they're cheap and they're making a huge difference already in two states, California and Texas. And this article really impressed me because it made me think, wow, if I'm building out big AI data centers and or any other kind of like compute centers, I really ought to co-locate around some of these kind of battery operations. So not only can I generate power, I have power to bear anytime there is a rainstorms, brown, I'm going to have like no brownouts, blackouts, anything else. I don't want to be able to do it without necessarily firing up a fossil fuel powered portable generator or whatever to keep things going. Anyway, it was interesting because it's different. It's not what we normally talk about, but it clearly plays in these energy pig AI kind of world that we're moving into.
Right. So what do you think for the average enterprise? How should they be thinking about stories like this?
I think if you're going to be building anything from a capital perspective, a manufacturing plant, distribution facilities, whatever, you're going to be a net consumer power. There's a sustainability and a green angle to this. There's an ESG angle to it as well. But I think even if all you did at your company is you threw up a big solar array on the roof of your building, and you have a battery, the battery thing will provide you extra power on nights, weekends, whatever, if you're running multiple shifts. And they're not expensive. That was the other thing the article brought out. So yeah, I think you really need to look at this because it has other non-financial, operational, and financial benefits to consider.
What this reminds me of a little bit is how AI has provoked like kind of an overdue data conversation. It seems like AI could also provoke an overdue energy conversation. And one of the things about that is that this notion that we can put ESG aside because it's a political hot potato doesn't make any sense to me, because so much of this is about bottom line concerns, regardless of where you stand on, this from a political perspective. And I have hot takes about that, of course, but to me, this is the conversation companies need to be having around how are we going to fare in our fragile grids as more demands are placed upon them, and also how do we optimize these costs in a more granular way. I mean, Brian, it's kind of shameful how far behind so many software vendors are in terms of integrating this kind of real-time energy management into their software. I mean, this could have been done a while ago. I don't understand why we've been waiting on these next-gen ESG vendors so long. But anyway, whatever.
Well, I actually have on my floor here in the corner of my office, I have this enormous pile of ESG material because I am going to dust off in the next few weeks that book I did, and I'm going to do a second version or edition on it that will be materially
Cool.
enhanced. So yeah, I'm right there with you on that. Let's go to the next
Cool.
slide.
All right, here we go.
I think this is the last one. This was an interesting article. It was a great bait click article, bait click headline for it that was basically "Train me or I'll walk." I think was the headline on it on the email piece that promoted it. But it did remind me that in all the conversation about all the changes that are going on and how we're trying to hire people based on skills and skill ontologies and everything else, that there still is this question of who's going to train the workers out there and what are they going to do? And I think these are two important questions for HR people in particular, because I don't think they're thinking enough about, what the roles really look like in a post AI or whatever kind of world. And what are the skills that are going to be required? Who's going to teach it? And are you are you going to have the materials ready to really make this happen in a timely fashion? The other thing is, I'm already seeing an AI education training kind of tool that knows just on watch, it's observing how you learn, how you study, and how you build competency online. It's figuring all that out so it changes the way you receive training to fit you, which is very different from the way training's been done for centuries, which is like there is an instructor and they teach everybody in the class the same way. And even the way course materials are delivered electronically, it assumes there is one and only way of that people will digest and pick up this stuff. And that's why you've got somebody in the class that will ace the material, and a whole bunch of others get midland kind of grades, and some are going to fail. And I think using AI to make sure that everyone not only passes but does really well, I think is a great thing. So I think we've got problems here all over the place on the skills and training, and we're not really talking about the right issues, I think, right now. So that's where this is at.
Let's revisit the AI conversation for a moment with this in mind, because I think this is a really good illustration of where I'm actually a little more enthusiastic as well. Because I think that hyper personalized training content is one of the better AI enterprise use cases to move ahead with. And, you can look at that from a couple different perspectives, because one is how many enterprises actually have enough human mentors to go around and enough quality training to go around for their employees as it sits now? Not very many. And like you said, they're not catered necessarily to the individual. And then you look at what you could do with this type of thing where you could train models on most of your material, and then with the updates and the updated course information, especially in fast changing fields, you can update that through knowledge graph type information and vectors and input that material and keep that information much more current. And so, okay, so what's the cost? That gets you maybe to a 95, 98% accuracy rate with that material. Okay, well, what goes wrong? Well, maybe occasionally you might get slightly inaccurate training information. But you know what? You were getting that anyway because essentially your current training information was pretty much 3-ring binders and equivalent in electronic PDF form or whatever. So the training material becomes out of date and isn't relevant anyway. So I really like this use case, Brian, and I think that if I'm an HR person, I really look hard at this because this has a lot less risk profile, for example, than putting AI into your recruitment and hiring.
Agreed. Next slide.
All right. Halftime. Viewers may not appreciate this, but photographer credit goes to Brian S. Summer. Brian, you were at this game. Wow.
Yeah, I was. I don't want to tell you. Let's just say I was in a prime sitting position there, right there at the in the goal line. All right. Well, John, you've been you've been on a tear lately. Interviewing all kinds of people and bugging all kinds of folks with, if I have pesky questions, yours must have been over the top, but you've been trying to find out all kinds of things related to RAG and the accuracy of some of the AI stuff and the agentic materials. Why don't you tell us very briefly, which I know that's going to be hard to do, but
Yeah.
what have you learned?
Right. So this was a fun one because basically I reached out to a bunch of vendors and with the same pesky questions that were troubling me, because I started by going to the experts who really have built LLM systems from the ground up and looked at this context of how do we properly evaluate these systems. And I started with RAG and published on that and a little bit on agents. And then the next piece is going to be how do we evaluate agents? And the reason I started with RAG and that type of context is that the major reason that vendors are talking about accurate results has to do with what they put into that context window. But vendors pretend like the LLM will always defer to that information that you're putting into the system, which might be up-to-date customer information or up-to-date reference information. But it's not always the case. Sometimes the LLM will choose to serve up something from its own training set, and usually that's very undesirable. And vendors don't want to acknowledge that, but that's both the beauty and the downside of these particular types of systems, is that they make their own decisions about things like that, and they don't always repeat it in the same way. So you can't actually control them, and vendors don't want to talk about this. But I found some really good companies that are working on evaluation metrics, and the best one, in my opinion, from the ones that I interacted with was Galileo, and so I had a dialogue with them around this. So the reason that I focus first on the context window and what that means is because basically you can measure it and you can look at how many times did the LLM defer to the context window versus its own training. And of course, you really, if you're building these things in, you want it to refer to your context as much as possible. But there's other things you can do. That's only one example of the things you can measure in terms of your performance there. And of course, what I was talking with this vendor about is getting more from that 80% range to more like 95%, which for a single query into an LLM system, like asking an agent or assistant, is actually pretty good for a lot of enterprise use cases. And so that's sort of where you want to start getting if you want to start even looking at some use cases and having some success. So example, first level support is an example where once you get into 95% for answering information, maybe not for customers, maybe for customers, but definitely for employees, that's a good ballpark. So I started there. And the reason I started there is that eventually I'm going to graduate into agents and agent evaluation. And the way to think about it really quickly is that agents do a bunch of things, but they might do this. They might do the RAG part and ask for context from like a knowledge graph or something, but they also might refer to different tools. And a tool could even be an API call. I was talking with Oracle about that today. So agents call a bunch of tools in order to achieve a goal. So agentic evaluation is a little bit different, but I started with the RAG context because it's so important for how vendors are pitching the accuracy of these models. And it is one of the major tools that agents will refer to, but agents are going to pull from all kinds of tools, not just RAG or context systems. So anyway, and Thomas says there is one vendor that acknowledges this problem and is actually researching its avoidance. You know them. Yeah, and I published about them too. And but everyone that I respect acknowledges that this is not a fixable problem. So don't believe the BS and the hype when a vendor tells you they've fixed this. You can't fix it. It's not fixable. It's inherent to these characteristics. Now, having said that, sometimes when you constrain a model to a very specific task or a very specific kind of information set, you can get even higher than 95. But the point is, you're dealing with probabilistic technology. So that's just the nature of the beast. And so I'm just sick of the hype around it. And I'm trying to push vendors to get away from bragging about how great their systems are and start talking about how you measure and improve the results and how you design use cases to mitigate the downsides and optimize the good sides, just like we just talked about with that really good HR use case. And hello, Sam. Welcome to the chat. Nice to see you. Anyway, Brian, that's my overview of my research.
So I lived this problem this week. I was trying to fly to Philadelphia on Tuesday, and uh, it turned out that the regional carrier was having a technology equipment problem and could not update the status of its flights. So at my airport, we're waiting on an inbound plane, but they could not update when it was coming in, let alone when our flight was going to go out and so forth. I tried calling the major carrier, and because they had their AI agent that I was interacting with on the phone, it wasn't used to this kind of a problem, so it wasn't in their skill set. But it also left me no alternative to actually talk to a real human being to find out what the hell's going on here. And I wanted answers to questions like, how is it that the guy sitting beside me in the lobby um, has already been rebooked onto another, and rerouted through O'Hare, and I'm still stuck, and this junk went on for hours, and delayed me like crazy, and it was all because the AI tool could not recognize the problem. It had nothing in its experience base that would deal with it, and it was a multi-party problem. It was with the regional carrier and the major mainline carrier and so forth, and nobody had any answers. I was livid. If I could have found a human being, I would have taken them apart. But what do you get in a small airport? Nothing. So yeah, this stuff. The limits are what drive you nuts. And if you're dealing with just basic things that get simple answers back, fine. Complex stuff and things that change dramatically day to day it's not a good use case for the AI stuff, not at all.
No, and even though I'm critical of the technology, and one of the reasons I tend to emphasize the critical side is because I want to help customers weigh out the pros and cons, and they have so many AI evangelists talking it up that I feel like they need to hear more of this. But in reality, Brian, like that type of use case you're describing can work as long as it's properly designed so that someone can escalate easily to a human when it's a non-routine query. And so sometimes we throw AI under the bus, but it's actually just poor design because there's no reason why an escalation function couldn't have been built into that. But what a lot of companies are trying to do is to say, "Oh, we don't need this anymore. We can just wing it with AI fielding all of the front level queries." And it's like, well, and it gets really frustrating, I think, in airlines in particular and other monopolistic industries because they have very little incentive to change their game, even if you're unhappy, because what are you going to do? You have so little portability in the airline industry to vote with your wallet. It's so frustrating. Anyhow. So
And as we
another feel good story in the Enterprise Month in Review.
Yeah, everything seems to go back to the airlines today. Okay, what else we got, John?
Sam wants to go easy on AI agents. They've just started their career, primarily interns. They will get there just like most of us. Yeah, and Sam, actually, that's one of the actual things I push back on a little bit because one of the excuses for these rollouts is that everything will get better over time, so let's just do it. And that's actually not a good way to go. It's much better to recognize that honestly, like, the agentic AI stems from generative, which stems from deep learning, which has been around for a pretty long time now. And many of the problems we're struggling with now have actually been anticipated and predicted as much as 15 years ago. Like these are not new problems, and they're not easily solved. That's the whole thing about this field, is that you're not suddenly just going to solve it because vendors are putting a lot of money into it. Anyway, Sam says Brian should most certainly not be their boss. So I don't know. Brian seems like he could crack the whip a little bit. I think if I have an AI agent, I want them reporting to Brian.
Well, Sam, good to hear from you again. I would just tell you that we'll go to the second part of your halftime show. Let's go do that.
Yeah, you don't want to riff on Sam first, or
I'm fine. Let's get into that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. So one more hot story, Klarna. you guys probably remember how this broke because it broke last August, and this provided so much fuel for the AI Krishnas around like that SaaS is dying, and it was all about this aggressive upstart Klarna company that moved supposedly got rid of Salesforce and Workday and built their own SaaS applications and all of this stuff. And we were on the ground that fall, and so I went and I got a direct response from Workday's AI chief, and then we got the same from Salesforce, so that was really fun. But to give credit, there were some analysts and some media outlets that were on this story pretty much from the get-go and reporting even months ago. Like one of them was CX Today, but they reported quite a long time ago that in fact Klarna had transitioned to Deal for HR and various other SaaS tools to replace CRM. So it had never really abandoned SaaS per se. But then, much more interestingly, recently, the CEO, Semiatowski, chose to raise the subject again and clarified all of this. And we have a piece on that in Diginomica that Stuart Laughlin wrote. And then I riffed on it a little bit in Hits and Misses, which I thought was an interesting thing to talk about because the thing about it is that he was actually doing some really interesting stuff, and I got to give Klarna credit for that. They were actually experimenting with Neo4j, which is one of the leaders around knowledge graphs, which is a whole different way of using RAG. Instead of using vector databases, using knowledge graphs, which does in some ways a better job of illustrating semantic relationships and stuff. It's quite an interesting area to look into. And they were really experimenting with feeding a lot of that information to their users, and I think a lot of those experiments were worthwhile. It's just that this was such a viral and poorly reported story when in fact, like SaaS, I would argue, is not dead at all. Instead, it's more that SaaS vendors are on notice to make sure that they've created modern, savvy, AI-enabled software. But I could go into more on why I think SaaS isn't dead. But the story got revisited basically because he made a bunch of clarifying comments. So that's what's going on there.
Well, I'll tell you what, John, I am going to go back and talk about Sam's comment. I've been thinking about that some more, so I'm going to recycle on that one.
All right, let's recycle.
Okay, so what I'm thinking is two things about the expectation of should these things work, and is it well? It's early days. We should be kinder, gentler, and I agree that that's bullshit. I find myself oftentimes dealing with clients who expect nothing less than perfection from me. And yet, business after business I deal with, I'm lucky to get mediocrity out of them. And I don't accept mediocrity. If I can't get away with that, then I think other companies shouldn't be able to get away with that either. But the other thing is, when I release systems, one of the things I do after we do all the testing cycles, unit testing and string testing and everything else, but when we get down to the final, user acceptance, if it's looking pretty good, I'll put out a deal to all the clients' users. I'll tell them, come bang away on this thing. If you can find a defect, I'll pay it could be $100 or $500. Find it. Because I don't want this thing to blow up or screw up once we go live. That's not the place you want to have this happen. And that's the argument I'm not hearing anybody saying is, well, let's go ahead and enable these agents and then let's run them through a rigorous testing and see how many bugs we find in all this, how many hallucinations, how many broken processes, how many processes don't work because we have the wrong prompts in here or whatever. I don't see that. And I don't think making apologies for, in effect, incomplete or defective technology isn't really going to move the needle here. I think we need to press vendors to do a far better job of delivering a better quality product. Now, Sam, you win. You got me wound up. Okay,
Sam,
you definitely did that.
Nice work, man. Sam, gold star, man. Where's my audience meter for Sam? There you go, Sam. You got Brian stirred up, man. You got that tea kettle to pop, and that's always a pleasure and good for our viewership to get that perspective. I want to hit on Dan's comments because he's right on this too. Dan says hello. He's just done a couple of podcasts on AI agents, and the thing that scares me about them is having bad processes that a company starts to automate with agents because they feel they have to do something. Then if they don't clean their data first, the agent's going to merely create a big mess unless a human is inserted properly in the loop. So Dan, let me share a couple of quick things about this. You're definitely right about that. And there's this concept of AI as an accelerant that's pretty important. And accelerant in both ways, right? If you have your act together, adding AI can bring that out further. If you have a mess and you try to put AI on top of that mess, it's a hot mess. It's gonna be worse. But Dan, even if you have really good data, et cetera, the agents are still not perfect tools. And so that's the other piece of the puzzle. And that's what I'm trying to bear down on as well, is how do you evaluate the performance of these tools? And I'll be writing about this. Did the agent pick the right tools? Did it pick the wrong tools? Because even if your tools are great, it could still pick the wrong one. And it's really, really important to understand that it's not just about getting your data clean. But in a nutshell, what SaaS vendors need to do to justify their existence is to show that they can provide better decision making than just pulling the data out. Because that was one of the things that Klarna CEO was talking about, is that looking at CRM just like a database, really. And it's that you have to prove you're more than a database. You have to prove that you help people make better decisions on data. And then I think you need to prove that your workflows matter, because ultimately, when you say agents are about automation, to an extent, yes, but you don't want agents automating routine processes that have already been built with existing workflows, because why would you want to replace a deterministic workflow with a probabilistic one? You wouldn't. I think what agents are particularly good at is extending those workflows to more people and allowing you to mix and match them a lot more creatively on the fly. And that gets really interesting. But man, you do have to proceed carefully here and not just sit here and go like, oh, this is going to get a lot better in the future. You have to really look at how you can stack up a win, because these AI projects, you need to have wins if you want to build momentum. Brian, comment.
Dan, good to see you on the line, and liked your comments. So kudos, thank you.
And Sam says the Klarna CEO finally grew up. One of the most immature comments. Pretty sure he got a ton of pushback from investors, and it sounded like he was a little bit mortified by some of the Salesforce blowback too, because the CEO of Klarna evidently thinks pretty highly of Salesforce too. I think part of it is that he's punching above his weight with a certain kind of viral marketing, but I think that kind of viral marketing can also do a lot of damage, self-inflicted damage too.
Well, let's go. I'm watching the clock because I know we're running out of time here.
Yeah. I think we'll probably linger a little bit because we're getting some action in the chat, but yeah, we should still move on. But keep the comments going, folks. We'll keep addressing those. And yes, great typo. Brian, Dan called you Brain. That is actually Brian's, one of his show nicknames is Brain Summer. So good job there. Here for the month.
Yeah, I know. People like
actually, this is the runner-up. This is the runner-up.
We have two runners-up and we have a finalist here. So okay. This was definitely one of the runners-up. I think you nominated this one, John. Why don't you give the context?
Oh, well, it's just, there were a bunch of things that came out around brain atrophy in generative AI. And I guess there's only some humor in that because we don't really know the long-term consequences of any of this stuff. But it's just kind of like the whole thing around like, just there's a whole bunch of whiffs that fit into all of this stuff. One of the big ones is how lawyers are continually getting into trouble worldwide for submitting court documents generated by ChatGPT. And here we're talking about the 80% ChatGPT, not the 95, which isn't even good enough, by the way, for court. But still, these are folks using the 80% version we were talking about and putting that shit in and then getting hauled across. And it's all about the loss of the ability to critically evaluate the technology you're using. And AI is just another technology. You have to critically evaluate it, and people are getting into trouble all over the place.
The piece, I would say, the one thing it should have looked at is beyond just the critical skills. This is around critical thinking. They were showing some interesting stats that it was kind of trailing off. People were using it as a crutch. But the other problem is what using AI almost comes with a deadening of understanding ethics. And that's how you end up with people using AI to fraudulently claim skills they don't have or whatever, just so they can get a job interview, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that was the first runner up. Our second runner up, John, tell us about this one.
Oh, well, this fits in with everything we're doing, so I'll cover it really quickly. But this was HP basically saying, like, we're going to try to deflect human support by making people wait an extra friggin' 15 minutes for a human instead of self-service. And my big message to HP was people don't want to call your voice line if they can solve the problem another way. Quit pretending that people are doing that. They're not. Your self-service sucks, or they wouldn't be calling your voice. Fix your self-service if you don't want voice calls. This is ridiculous. Anyway,
And to that point, John, when you do try to use their digital tools, not just them, but Microsoft, I recently had to, I bricked a laptop and had to buy a new one and transfer stuff. I needed some answers. And you try and go online, and what you find is there's like 19 places somebody has allegedly posted a fix to the whatever problem I'm having. No two of them are the same. No one's ever bothered to coalesce the stuff into a single, here's how you fix this problem once and for all. No, they don't do that. There's just all these scattered threads and fragments of junk everywhere. So I don't buy the defense that you need to push people off of that. People are calling in because your digital assets are such junk. And that's why they have to call to get help.
Yep, and because I couldn't find the answer on Reddit either, which is where I get 95% of my self-service stuff resolved, not from your freaking support documentation, but from freaking Reddit. Oh my God. All right.
Or YouTube. Yeah. Okay.
Or YouTube, right. YouTube. Thank God for YouTube and some tech fixes there. Thomas is back to the agent thing. Fully agree with you. If one implements an agent-based system for some parts of processes, they better show improved performance for the company right away, which gets back to your point too, Brian. And then needs a solid set of KPIs that define success or better. I was talking with a vendor about this today, about the importance of establishing metrics. And so in a nutshell, Thomas, two kinds of metrics. One is the kind I'm writing about now, which is evaluation, like how did the tool perform? When did it make mistakes? All of that. That needs to be measured. But then also the business outcome type of metrics need to be built in too. So both of those need to happen. And then Sam, real quick on Klarna. If you want to do negative marketing, don't go up against the masters of negative marketing. Pick what you are really good at. Okay.
Boy, Sam's got the catty stuff going today here. Meow.
We gotta be careful with Sam, because Sam's like cleverly like putting logs on the fire, like to kind of up the ante of the thing. And now I'm getting riled up too. And like, this is just getting a Friday afternoon chaos here.
I got a feeling John's going to turn this podcast into his entire hits, miss, and whiffs article for Monday next week.
And Brian, here's our winner. And Brian, this is one's cool because I thought you would like this one, and I sent it to you, and you did like it.
Yeah, and I'd actually, I love this one. The whole idea that an AI provider wants to hire people, but it doesn't want them to use AI, to optimize or whatever you want to call it, their resumes. It's so beyond the pale and insane that they do this. And I get why they do it. I really do. If I were a recruiter, the last thing I'd want to read is somebody's bullshit laden job description matching buzzword tracking kind of thing. I don't want to read it because I don't know anything about how is this the authentic person I'm interviewing or some clone of something. And then see an AI company doesn't want you to do this. I'm like, oh boy, have we come full circle on AI stupidity with this? And that what a great way to wrap up, one of the last things we're going to cover for this month in review. This is icing on the cake here, folks.
So Brian, the other thing about this that's great is you've had a whole stump speech going on for a while around what are HR managers going to do when candidates have the ability to apply for 5,000 jobs.
Right.
So now you have a big AI vendor saying, "Hey man, this isn't any fun.
Yeah.
We're not
Cry me
having
a
fun
river,
anymore."
Anthropic. Yeah. Yeah. They can dish it out, but they can't take it. Can't, anyway.
Well, and you know the other funny thing about this too is like, in fact, wouldn't the most skillful way of getting a job in Anthropic be to use Anthropic to fool Anthropic? Like,
Oh,
because then they would be like, "Oh my god, like you actually sounded like a real person using our tools to mimic a real person." It seems like that would qualify you for a nice, well-paying job at Anthropic. But anyway,
I,
so
when John told me about the story, I went immediately to the comments. And there's one of the comments, you can see it, it's kind of small underneath the winner badge. But someone goes, even AI companies can't stand their own computer generated bullshit. And folks, that's one of the cleaner comments. And
yeah, and I
another,
actually said in hits and misses, I said that I take this as a throwdown challenge, and I'm ready to do my first AI generated job application. I'm up for this, and I'm sending it directly to Anthropic.
well,
Absolutely.
I knew we were going to do this call today, this podcast today, and I also knew earlier this afternoon I was going to be doing I was interviewing an ATS vendor that's using AI technology. They're a new startup, and of course, like all startups, the first thing they tell me is, "But Brian, we're new, we're different." They're always different, man. They're still kind of, some things are never change. And then I crack up, they're telling me all this, and then I'm pressing it and I find out the technology still uses the same kind of like matching technology. And if you get like 1,400 people apply for a job, the recruiter has the ability to narrow down the word matches to say, I need somebody that matched 90 to 100% of the critical, words, that we're looking for. I go, so you're basically creating a tool that only works on resumes that have been perfected by AI tools. So, how does that help an employer find out who the really good people are if all it's doing is processing machine generated junk? And then the crickets started chirping. Anyway, this this story was the one to end, the broadcast today.
Absolutely. I'll
Um,
let you know how my application goes, but I'm definitely
oh,
looking forward to applying.
And and to that end, I knew I was going to be doing all this stuff. So this morning, I applied for a job with a major company here in the Indianapolis area to see what their latest and greatest ATS kind of technology is. So, like I always do, I use my real name and resume and everything else, and I fired this one off. And the first thing I noticed is the ATS. It's working. It's asking me a couple of questions. It's working rather well. And then it goes, okay, so Brian, why don't you upload your resume? And as soon as I did, it presents my education, and this thing somehow decided that I had gone to college at Arizona State, which swear hand on the Bible, I have never been a student at Arizona State for anything ever. But it needed to know, well, what degree did you get there and what years were you there? And I'm like, how did they come up with this bullshit? I mean, if an ATS still can't parse my resume, how will an AI tool get trained if it can't even figure that out? I mean, we still don't have the basics yet. And yet we're trying to use all the advanced stuff. Anyway, I'm sorry, you got me going, but
No worries.
oh,
I wish you good luck. I hope you get an interview because I know you're still smarting from not being able to get an interview with Accenture. Can you at your local office there? Can you just remind me and the listeners what was the maximum head count of people that you once supervised at Accenture?
I had three legal entities at one time and had on those about 200 were my main folks.
Yeah,
But I was responsible for like, say, for when it came to like rolling out the process reengineering competency, that was 19,000 people.
nineteen
Uh,
thousand. Yeah, but now can't get a friggin' interview. Man, where's AI when you need it, man? What the hell? Anyway,
anyway, anyway. So I think we're. I don't. I think we're out of time. But think what inspires or creates value. Do we have anything left? I mean, we've been running down AI hard today. So do we have anything not AI related?
Well, I always think these kinds of chats create value in it. When our audience started kicking in there, thanks folks. It just really made my afternoon, because that's how I get smarter, is through the people there, and that's the whole go of this show, is not just to share what we've seen, but to kind of use you all as a sounding board to see where we are. So thanks for that. And finally, I will say that I think sometimes value is where you find it. I just found on YouTube an amazing live performance of "You Can't Always Get What You Want" from 1973 vintage Rolling Stones. Do a search on that. Talk about value. Wow. That I was just sitting there, just staggered by what I was listening to. And I was like, man, I found some value.
Well, if you're going to do music stuff, I would highly recommend people get the Mavericks when they did an album when they were performing on Austin City Limits. That one's a really good one. If you guys want something else to read for this weekend, I would recommend Time Magazine had a story on why companies aren't held accountable for data breaches, which is rather sobering. There was also a great story in Bloomberg Business Week called Culling the Startup Herd. And it's pretty sobering because it talks about how in the tech world, valuations are going down. The numbers of unicorns have just falling off a cliff, and. And when you add that to where kind of the stock market and stuff is going lately, it could be some tougher times out there for some of the software companies. So if you want to get inspired, you might want to think about, do I want to throw my hat in and my pocketbook in and maybe pick up some bargain deals here if you're so inclined, or you might want to be thinking a little more carefully, because I think some of the go rah kind of stuff is something needs to be tempered. Anyway,
Brian, Dan's trying to rile you up before we head out, man.
an SAP S4
You could
HANA.
always be a S4 HANA consultant when you grow up.
Ja, ja, Dan, das ist richtig. Meine Deutsch ist sehr gut und SAP is fantastic. Anyway.
By the way, Thomas is commenting on your paper newspapers, and folks, if you don't know this, Brian actually curates a lot of his best stuff from paper editions of various publications. So he's old school.
So. Yeah, I still read all these magazines that John doesn't get, and I tried to convince John to read one of the stories in this month's MIT Technology Review, but he wouldn't let me. He wouldn't let me use it on the show today. So anyway,
we could say it. We could say what it's about, though.
No, we don't. We'll let it go. Anyway,
let's just say that it's a topic you wouldn't expect in MIT Technology Review.
There you go.
And leave it at that. I will also say that this is probably of interest to only a fraction of a fraction, but just in case it is, I upgraded to the best bookmarking tool I've ever used in the last 2 weeks. It's called Raindrop. And I'm hopeful it'll be around for a while, because it's one of those commercial things, and I'm hoping it's being run like a small business that'll sustain itself, because some of these niche tools are trying to just be for the long term and just be smaller businesses. Raindrop.io, fantastic bookmarking tool, imported 22,000 bookmarks, and the search inside it is fantastic. So anyway, I'm a big fan of whatever it is. Create your own research and curation process that works for you. If you like bookmarking, look at Raindrop. It's 10 times better than Pocket and any of the other ones I've used recently. So, Brian, you got any final words?
Yeah, I think we've long overstayed our welcome here.
Yep,
but
yep, we're done. Is this and that's our last slide. So we are good. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And we're actually going to be doing the month in review a little more often going forward. We just had a couple of logistical things, but you should see us through the spring, and maybe some on-site podcasts once the event calendar heats up. We'll see. So anyhow, good to see you, Brian.
Likewise. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye, Brian.
All right.